Before we begin, since this is a BBC-owned property, I feel the need to point out that the news arm of the BBC has a continuing issue with transphobic leanings in its news coverage. You can find in a pinned comment below various videos from both myself and other YouTubers covering this issue. And while I understand that the Doctor Who creative team is not responsible for this, I will continue to point this out for as long as it remains a consistent issue. Thank you. Between this and Rosa, is Chibnall's Era the one that did the most American set historical episodes? Huh. Nikola Tesla's Night of Terror. So this is an episode that, honestly, in terms of my memory, kind of went in one ear and went out the other. It didn't really stick with me at all, either in a good way or a bad way. So my memory of it was basically that it was forgettable. And that kind of became my memory by default. I couldn't remember a ton of my thoughts on it. I could remember the episode overall. I could remember the characters who showed up. I remember the monsters. But like, in terms of how any of that made me feel, the lingering feeling was just like, oh, that was fine. And it is, but it's a little bit better than that. There's more going on in this presentation than I think I've given it credit for up to this point. It's not some kind of overlooked gem that a lot of people are sleeping on or anything like that, but it just left a better impression when I was really kind of focusing in, already knowing what it was and looking for the strong and the weak points. And there aren't that many weaknesses, and there's a decent number of strengths. Not epically amazing strengths, but strengths nonetheless. And sometimes just a solid piece of entertainment is what you're after. And this gives you that. Why don't we start with the guest cast? I actually really like Nikola Tesla as portrayed by Goran Vizinjic. I probably just butchered that, but he does a really good job. He does an excellent job of bringing through performance the idea of how excited but also kind of worn down he is. The man had so many ideas, so many notions, thoughts, ways to improve the world, but he was just not given the opportunity and the resources he needed. And you can get both that excitement and that frustration, which is nice to see both in the same place, because the lazy way to play this is to have it be like a switch on and off. He's either really excited or he's completely jaded, but we see both in play at the same time, and that's pretty well done. I also like how Thomas Edison is handled. Now, Edison is not a good guy in this, like, at all. And I would say kind of rightfully so. Edison is a very important figure, but I don't think there's any real problem with painting him as a little bit of a sinister one, and a bit of an exploitative one at that, because what the episode shows is not inaccurate. There were tons of patents with his name on them. How many of them he actually came up with or worked on, that's more debatable. It makes that distinction between inventor and businessman. Edison was an amazing businessman, and he was an inventor, but he couldn't hold a candle to Tesla. But Tesla didn't know business. He wasn't willing to play that game, and he lost as a result. Because when it's a capitalist system, you don't get to just opt out of playing that game. That's the game. You play or you lose by default, which is kind of what happened to him. But I don't think, for the demonizing that goes on with Edison, they don't completely go as hard as they could have. So, like, for example, when a whole bunch of his researchers in his own lab get killed by the aliens, he does express genuine remorse.
People have died.
My workers. All those men worked for me. They had families. I had dinner with this guy and his wife last week.
It does show him to be a human being. We're not going to the extreme of, say, the capitalist character in Thin Ice, who, being not a real, genuine person, was actually pretty fair to just strawman the heck out of him for the purposes of the point that episode was making. But they're not doing that with Edison, because they're like, yes, he takes advantage of people, but that doesn't mean that he is completely inhuman in his view of the people who work for him. Is he taking advantage of them? Well, yeah, absolutely. It doesn't mean he doesn't see them as people. And again, that feels nicely balanced. He's not a good guy, but he's not a monster. We do have monsters, though. We have the Skithra, which I don't love as a name, but they're basically an alternate version of the Rachnos, which I don't think ever actually gets said in the episode, which actually is kind of funny. There's a bunch of stuff this episode doesn't do that it's better for it. So like, for example, it does not, at least to my memory, explicitly make the connection between the Rachnos and the Skithra. If it is, it's a very throwaway line. And it makes it something that is just there for people who know more of Doctor Who to go, oh, they must be related to this. This is like the scorpion variant, the Rachnos for the spiders. But if you don't, like, it doesn't impact your ability to enjoy this story. I appreciate that the Skithra queen obviously had a much easier time speaking with those teeth than the Rachnos queen did. And thank goodness, too, because, look, the Rachnos visually was amazing, but listening to her talk like this, it took me out of every scene. We're not dealing with that here. And another thing I appreciate is the episode does not do the super explicit, let's sit down and point out to Edison how he is like them. Because the Skithra are running a ship that is cobbled together from stuff that other people made, but they use and get the benefits of. So there's a very clear parallel between them and Edison. It's not a one-to-one, but there's strong parallels there. And the episode doesn't sit down and stop the story in order to point that out. It respects the audience enough to make that connection, which is nice, especially given that Series 11 especially had a tendency to basically sit either the characters or the audience down and like kill the momentum to lay out, here's the themes, here's the real life background on this character. And there's some of that. We get some of that information on Tesla, but honestly, even though it is very much still expositional dialogue, it's delivered better. These feel much more like statements people might actually make. Yes, it's still exposition, but it's not like King James in Witchfinders, who just vomits his Wikipedia bullet points out. Or Rosa, where it literally stops to actually have a lesson. But we still get the core information for people who might not know who Nikola Tesla is, but in a way that just flows better. It's just refined. It's less clunky. If you still have a problem with expositional dialogue, you might still have a problem with this. But as someone who is willing to accept that to a certain degree, especially in something as long as an episode of Doctor Who is, sometimes you need to do it. And this is decently done. I also feel like this episode has a little bit more respect for life. One of the things that ended up being a recurring issue for me across Series 11 was that the episodes could feel cruel in how callously people got killed and how little acknowledgement there was of it when that happened. And it just felt mean-spirited to me a decent chunk of the time. Here, while there is definitely a body count here, as I said, the Skithra wipe out like an entire room of people, we have someone like Edison expressing like, this is horrible, what happened? Someone who actually knew them and seems to feel genuine remorse. So there's more weight put on the deaths that are there. And there's a number of characters that I feel like if this was done in Series 11 would have been killed but aren't here. People like Tesla's assistant, who might also have just been spared because she might have been a real life person. I didn't check that. But like also later on, there's this kid in the street, and I would not have put it past Series 11 to kill that. Well, maybe not kill that kid, but like to have whoever was the person in the street just get killed. Like for no reason. We've established that the Skithra are deadly. We don't need to reestablish it. But I could totally see Series 11 just killing whoever that was. In this case, it doesn't. Maybe it doesn't because they picked it to be a kid. But either way, there feels like there's more acknowledgement of death and there's less callousness and just like, oh, somebody died, move on. And that's nice, given that that was a little bit of a recurrent issue for me the last series. If there's one thing that it's not the worst thing in this episode, but I'm going to point it out because it's something that's going to come up with some issues that I have with later episodes. So I want to kind of set it up here. When Tesla sort of floats the idea or a willingness to turn himself over to the Skithra, basically saying like, look, what they're going to do is horrible. I am willing to turn myself over. It bothers me a bit that the Doctor's rationale for telling him he can't do that is because he's going to change history.
You must all go. Let them take me.
That's not gonna happen.
No.
Nikola Tesla, you're gonna change the world.
Now, that's not necessarily her only reason. She does go on a bit, but like that's the first thing she points out. It's like the fact that he is one of the great men of history is the overriding reason to not let him do this, as opposed to just, he's a human being. And no human being should just be turned over to have whatever the Skith are going to do to him happen to them. And that troubles me. And again, it's a bit of a setup for a later episode. But that troubles me because by putting that emphasis on how important he is to history, that makes it feel like she might not have gone to this extent to save somebody who wasn't him. And I like to think she still would, but I don't like that it's presented in a way that leaves even the possibility that that might be the case. Like, and I get he's important. I'm not trying to make an argument that he isn't, but in my mind, that should not be the Doctor's go-to point as to why you don't turn somebody over to aliens. You don't turn somebody over to aliens because every life matters. You shouldn't have to point out that this life in particular is super, super special. And as time has gone on, I have increasingly had just a negative gut reaction to, I don't know if this is what it's actually called, but what I tend to think of as the great man view of history, which is how, at least when I was in school, most history is taught. You're taught about kings, emperors, rulers, generals, the people who are recorded by history, and to a certain extent that can't be helped because those are the people that we have the best records on. But at the same time, it paints an image of history as being driven by the actions of a handful of very special men because of the patriarchal nature of most of the civilizations that have kept any decent records at all. They have been ruled by men, so there's better records on them. And it creates this illusion that there are the great men and then there's everyone else. And that's not necessarily deliberate in the way that history is taught, but it is something that is kind of a fallout of the way history tends to be taught. The reason I bring all of this up here is because a show like Doctor Who has the ability, because it is setting stories actually in the past, so that while we are meeting great figures of history, they are not all that we meet. It has the opportunity and the ability to make the point that no, it's not just about a handful of quote-unquote great men. Unfortunately, the show rarely takes proper advantage of that. We have some stories that do. I'll bring up Thin Ice again, which doesn't really have a prominent historical figure in it at all. It's about the setting and the environment that existed at that point of time. And that's kind of what I wish Doctor Who would do more often, as opposed to focusing in historical set episodes around a single important person. So it's just the pointing out, I mean, the structure of the thing, but especially the pointing out, like, we can't let anything happen to you because you matter too much, feeds into that entire mentality. And it just bugs me. And just to tangent for a quick second, just to make my point, I'm going to give you a name that you should know, but probably don't. Frank Wills. Frank Wills was the security guard at the Watergate complex who noticed tape over a latch in a door and first reported it, and that's what broke open the entire Watergate scandal. So even though Watergate is remembered as being a Nixon thing, there are many people involved, and the whole thing was discovered because of the actions of someone who would never be labeled as a great man of history. Normal people matter. And that's something that I wish Doctor Who would acknowledge more. And I know I'm dwelling on this, but again, it's because I know this is going to be a bigger problem for me down the road. But we'll get to that when we get there. Overall, there's a rollicking adventure feel to this that I just like. I like when Doctor Who goes for that tone and that feel. So it's well-paced, it's well-acted, the exposition's better delivered. It just feels more refined. It's not a million miles away from the historicals of Series 11, but it just feels more polished. And it kind of shows that a lot of the bones of what was in Series 11 weren't bad inherently. They just needed a little more work. And this feels like the product of a little more work. I like it. I think it went up a little bit in my estimation. Not massively, but a little. Nikola Tesla's Night of Terror. Have you rewatched it lately? What did you think about it? Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. Patreon's what pays the bills and enables me to do this as my living. It also gets you early access to these videos up to a week before they premiere publicly. Any amount that you help me will get you that perk, and there's other perks besides. But even if you can't, like, share, subscribe, help me out as well. Don't worry too much about that either, because what I really want you to remember is that you are beautiful, you are valid, and you are loved. You are the council. I'm just running the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned. End of the video, so I got to shout out my top patrons. Robin Moore, Zubin Lutfulla, Tarak, the thing that goes doink in the anime, Oliver B., Angus Bjarnason, Melinda Walters, Imudelki, The Oath of Boyd, Katoria, Toy Lowly, Becky Sparks, Fernambulax the Poodle, Zach, Tracy Scrabbit, Angry Casperl, Tim Price, Adam R.D.L. Taylor, Shayla Gourlay, and Brendan LaRose. Thanks for your support. If you want to hear me probably mispronounce your name as well, check out the rewards on the Patreon. How you doing there?